This is Cameo with Sarah Luria and Kimberly Reed, director and writer of Dark Money and also a documentary film, Prodigal Son. You're here with us to answer a few questions.
Yeah.
So I guess my first question, it's an easier one. How long did Dark Money take to make? Because it took place over like the journey of discovering about campaign finance and the underbelly of it. It took place over many years. Did you film that entire time, or did you go back and find other people's footage? How did that go?
I filmed the entire time, starting from in 2012, and I finished in 2018 when the film premiered at Sundance. So 6 years.
Wow.
I originally thought it was just going to take 6 months. I thought I was just filming one court case that was going to the U.S. Supreme Court, but that case didn't turn out in a way that was dramatically satisfying. So I ended up going and covering election cycle after election cycle. Ultimately, I did 3, so it took 6 years.
Yeah, that makes sense. You can really see that because you covered really well the breadth and expanse of Dark Money itself. I had a question that related to that. So since you filmed it over about 6 years, what was it like shaping a narrative documentary like that as it was happening?
Yeah.
Were you going around following the story that you knew, or would you just hear about someone that knew more about Dark Money and be like, well, I'm going there, I'm going to film them and ask them questions?
A little bit of both, and I think that's always what it should be. If I think it's good to ask a lot of questions with documentaries and not just have all the answers when you walk into something. So just because that's the situation, you're going to end up casting a net that's much wider than the one that you ultimately need. A lot of stuff ends up on the cutting room floor. So I was following a lot of leads that didn't pan out. I was also following just the larger story of money and politics in a way that, it gets tighter and tighter as you get closer and closer and figure out how the game is being played and how you need to show how the game is being played. And so that's ultimately what I did. And then, you have some surprises along the way. I knew of the court case that involved Representative Art Whittick, and I knew that was moving forward. I didn't think it would go to trial, but when it did go to trial, that was an important part of the story to tell, and that ultimately became sort of the ending point of the film.
Definitely, and I think you did a really good job of tying everything back to Montana, where you started the film and where you ended it, but you also were able to cover the entire U.S., but also come back to Montana. That also relates to a different question I had, which was, as a documentarian, what tips and what ways have people helped you build your documentary skills? Like, it could be someone you look up to as a documentarian or someone who's just giving you good advice. What are some skills that you've learned over the years making your documentary?
Yeah, a lot of it is kind of embedded in the question that you asked, because I think if you're going to tackle a really big subject like campaign finance or campaign finance reform, it's a huge issue that has a lot of tentacles all over the place, and there's a lot of people who are trying to follow the money, but that makes a very confusing film to try to follow. So my answer to that, and my answer usually to this question when tackling really big issues, is to find a small story within that is kind of a miniature. It's a microcosm of how that story functions, and that's what we do in Dark Money, is to tell this story that takes place in Montana as an example, as a case study. I often described it as a little petri dish in which this experiment was happening. And if you select those microcosms, those small stories, sometimes people call them, as opposed to a big story, if you select that small story carefully and you stick with it and you're kind of honest about where it pertains to the larger world and where it doesn't, then you can tell a story in this small way that can be extrapolated from by the audience, and they can apply it to the bigger picture. So the idea is that, if this is going on in Montana, it's probably going on in a bunch of other states. Yeah,
that's very true. As I was watching it, I was thinking, like, if this is just Montana, what's happening everywhere else?
Yep.
It's so funny. In the film, the Koch brothers were mentioned. We had a scandal this year at GMU where the Koch brothers donated something like $50 million to our university, and we're doing the exact same thing, something similar to the money in politics in your film, it's money in education, where they basically just put the people they want in.
Yep.
But also, on that same vein, there were students and there were faculty members at GMU who were seeing something that was wrong and being like, I want to change that. I want more transparency.
Mm-hmm.
And on that same vein, in the last few minutes of your film, the woman who resigned from the FEC,
Anne Rabel.
Yes.
Yeah.
She said, "This is where politicking is going. It's going to be the Wild West." With issues like these, and also with issues that are really high profile, for example, the recent memo about the transgender identity markers that might be completely destroyed. Do you really think that American voices will be able to push through and to make a difference? Because the end of your film, it's, I would really like to stay away from being like, oh, it was positive and hopeful, but it was realistic, but in a way that made you want to make something change.
I hope the way it feels to people is kind of like exactly what happened here. Mm-hmm. That if people are engaged and you demand transparency and you pay attention and you're skeptical enough of like this disinformation that's flying around, that people can pay attention and demand that transparency and figure out, follow the money is the phrase that you always hear, that people can follow the money and figure out where that money is trying to influence policy, influence education, influence, candidacies that they're trying to influence in different campaigns, different political campaigns, influence judicial elections, judicial nominations. Whenever you have power, you're gonna have money that's following that. And so whether it's in an educational institution like GMU or in a tiny election in Montana that not many people are paying attention to, if you can follow the money and the influence that it's trying to have, that transparency, I think, is ultimately, I know it's really good for democracy. I think it's really good for educational institutions as well. And just kind of the same answer to both.
I really appreciate that. Let's see what else. Are there projects that you're excited for? What types of filmmaking are you thinking of doing in the future? It's also okay if you don't know. Sometimes filmmaking just takes its own form in your life, and you end up going with something you didn't know you were going to go with.
Yeah, it's going to take its own form. And like I said, the projects that I'm working on now, I have a lot of questions. I'm not sure exactly where they're going to go, and talking to a bunch of people about what to do next. So I don't have an answer to that right now. I wish I did.
Well, that's fair, because you never know exactly where it's going to go. And films like Dark Money come along by you asking the questions and continuing to follow it. And it took 6 years. I don't expect an answer for that. So for when you were filming in Montana, how difficult was it to get into those spaces, like people's homes? A lot of the representatives were farmers, had normal jobs. How hard was it to say, I want to interview you and I want to come into your own space and do that? That's my question, if that makes sense.
It was, I didn't have a lot of problems getting a hold of people. And sometimes it's a little bit more difficult to say, hey, look, I don't want to just, sit you down in a room against a blank wall and like talk to you for 3 hours, which is sometimes what people are a little bit more comfortable doing. It makes for a better documentary scene, I think, if people are in their place, in their environment, doing what a lot of times they do normally. And sometimes that takes a little bit of convincing with people to just have them do something normal instead of this really formal thing in front of a camera. People are sometimes, that's what they have in mind. So that takes a little bit of convincing. But in terms of just getting access to people, I didn't have a lot of problems doing that. I think a lot of the reason for that is because I'm from Montana. Right. I knew those folks, or I knew somebody who knew them. Yeah. And I also think that it's important for there's kind of two thoughts about it. Sometimes the view of an outsider can be knowing and seeing in a way that somebody who's all caught up in something can't really interpret what's going on because they're kind of inside the bubble. But it's also very important, by that same token, for people who are members of a community to tell their own story. And that's how this felt. It felt like I know these people. When I talked to Senator Tester, I grew up going to a farm that my dad grew up on, and then my uncle still farmed, and my great-grandfather homesteaded, and that was, just as crow flies, really, really close to Tester's farm. It was the same type of farm, same type of tractor, same type of, crops that they were growing, and that guy he feels like my uncle, and I know how to talk to him. Exactly. So having that sort of familiarity with the place and who these people are, and meeting them on their own ground, I think is also really important. And the conversations that you have as a documentary filmmaker can be more revealing than some filmmaker from New York who kind of parachutes in and isn't really in touch with what's going on the ground.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. I had a question written down that was something along the lines of Prodigal Sons was an extremely personal project for you because you were in it, obviously.
Yep.
But I realize now that I think my automatic assumption was that Dark Money was a little less personal, but it's really not. It's extremely personal to you. You're from Montana, and it's something you've known your whole life.
Yeah.
But I still would ask, what were some of the differences between making Prodigal Sons, which was personal in the way that it had to deal with you as a person, versus Dark Money, which is personal in a sense of home, like your home state.
Yeah, I think I don't know. I mean, if you're going to work on a project for 6 years, it had better be personal, because there's like one of the few things that's really driving you. It makes a big difference being on the other side of the lens. That's a huge step into it. And for Prodigal Sons, I also narrate that film as well. So that was another big difference. But there are more similarities, I think, than people realize initially. Like, for example, the role that I play as a narrator and a sort of guide through the film of Prodigal Sons is not that dissimilar than the role that John S. Adams, the investigative reporter in Dark Money, plays, who's kind of becomes the eyes and ears of the audience, and we start to see the world through his eyes and do this investigative reporting as he's figuring out how these groups actually function. So it's a really old story in terms of how storytelling works. The Odyssey, is told through the eyes of one character, and you go all over the world, you see all sorts of things, but it's about this one guy's quest to get back home. And it's not a unique or a novel storytelling idea to have one main narrator who's pulling you through this, but that's certainly the way that I think it's very helpful, especially when you're dealing with such a big story as campaign finance reform. It's very helpful to have that kind of central character who's pulling you through it.
That's very true, and almost, John Adams, in a way, is the central character, because you see him throughout his life as he's following this. First he's living out of his truck, and then he's starting his own press business and going on. But also, in a way, I feel like Montana is the main character, or the specific towns that you talk about in the film, because they have this life to them. Sorry, I just wanted to, that was just... It's just really interesting. You really created a very good frame for the story to be told around a very personal place.
And it's also, people, when they watch films, like to go someplace and see something and experience. Like, you don't just want to be lectured at for 90 minutes. You want to be transported. And Montana's a beautiful place. It's full of really interesting people. So, what each scene does in Dark Money is not just kind of lecturing people on the rules of campaign finance reform. You want to take some people to a place and have them feel like they're in that and they understand it.
Exactly.
And what that also does is there's a couple metaphors that are working throughout the whole piece about, just land and what happens to it when you don't take care of it, and what happens when you have a big body of poisonous water that birds land in and die in. Human beings can relate to that no matter where they are. And so, when you take somebody to this place and let them fall in love with it a little bit, like I think Montanans do, and then show them what happens when money kind of gets out of control, money in politics gets out of control, you know, it all kind of hews back to what the film is doing, talking about campaign finance reform. But it's all in the service of those scenes.
Yeah, in the service of the morals and the values that anyone can relate to, the sense of home that you don't want destroyed, like you said, the geese,
Yeah.
the acidic lake, stuff like that.
Yeah. And
So-
really interesting people pulling you through it too. And I
Exactly.
think people that maybe, like, I think a lot of audiences might be surprised that, you know, those folks live there.
And working class people as well. The
Yeah.
oh my gosh, the tiny blue house that
Yeah.
is the of political practices, I
The
think.
Commission of Political
That's what it
Practices.
is.
Yeah.
Just those people working really hard, even though they're underfunded,
Mhm.
and they're really working to create something for good.
Yep.
I guess my final question would be: do you have any words of wisdom or words of? Actually, let me rephrase. If you could give advice to yourself in the past, a younger documentarian you, what would you tell yourself? And this is also serves as wisdom for filmmakers right now. I know, you know, a lot of my friends are aspiring filmmakers. It's very hard. It's a place you can easily get very doubtful of whether you're going to even succeed or be worth anything. What are some words of wisdom / advice to yourself that you could give?
You know, one thing I mentioned a lot, we did like a live Twitter chat yesterday, and they said, mention two things, and this was one of them, was it's something that we already talked about. The fact that to tell a huge story, you have to find a small story that people can understand, that they can connect to emotionally, that has characters who are anchors for this story. And it also helps if you have a strong sense of place, like you see in Dark Money with, you know, being in Montana. And if you can find that grain of sand that allows you to, it gives you this little microcosm, like I was saying earlier, you can find the whole world in that grain of sand. So I think that what I see a lot of people do, what I think I did, like in film school and stuff, was to try to tackle these enormous stories with enormous storylines and complications. And it's the real challenge is how you distill all of that down into a smaller story that people can really relate to.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
This has been Cameo with Sarah Luria and Kimberly Reed, director and writer of Dark Money.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.